God created an institution on this earth, not only to restore fallen man back into the image of God, but to also heal the deep pain and wounds of broken communities, and to help the outcast and the downtrodden in society. But it has sadly forgotten its first love, neglected its global mission, and it is craving acceptance from a world that she is meant to be a witness to. She is ignoring and overlooking a very pressing issue that is widening a deep gulf between communities. It is a sensitive topic that cannot be overlooked, and if she has the boldness to confront it head on, she will help to create harmony and heal some deep wounds in a world where many are sadly losing hope. Racism. It is a controversial topic that creates a bone of contention. Now, I've covered it briefly in a number of studies: slavery and race, the origin of nations, and geoengineering. Now, in this study, we're going to cover some very controversial areas that is going to make many people feel very uncomfortable. But at the end, I'm going to offer a solution. And as I encourage at all times, please research everything you see in this study. When you look into the mirror, you're not just seeing your own reflection. You're seeing years of an inherited blueprint being passed down throughout history. Many of us resemble our appearance, but it is a continuous chain of a genetic feature. Some of the distinct features we have are passed down from generations. Our characters may be our own, but we still have our great-great-great-grandparents' distinct eyes or their very distinct nose and lips. Even if you are unaware of it, as one Western writer so rightly phrased it, each one of us are a walking museum. Though we have differences in our outward appearances, we are living in a time where different groups are thoroughly convinced false education via academia, the media, or their social or religious groups that they are far superior to others in either technology, morals, or in their outward appearance. And if a member of one of these groups decides to step outside of his or her tribe to form a future liaison or an eternal pact in marriage with another ethnic group, it is seen as selling out or a very deep betrayal to the tribe that will destroy and break up the distinct genetic gene pool and that will produce confused children. Now, anyone who has any level of common sense should know that in all communities around the world, from time immemorial, most people marry and stick to their own cultural or ethnic group, people they can identify with and relate to, and they very rarely branch out. That's just a fact. So when a few do step outside, it does very little to damage a lineage. But there are some truths that we cannot ignore. Some mixed couples still carry their community's deep prejudices into the marriage that can cause a lot of harm and distress. And studies have also shown that children of mixed parentage in our modern digital age suffer with a very deep identity crisis. It has been labeled as racial imposter syndrome, trying to fit in and belong to a group where they are told that you're either not black enough, or you're not white enough, or you're not Asian enough, or whatever group they try to identify with. Studies have shown that the demographics of people who have been categorized or labeled as mixed race, biracial, or multiracial face the highest levels of social exclusion than any other racial or ethnic group on the earth. That leads to higher levels of mental health as a result of dual identities. But this is only a product of recent times. This was not an issue back in the day, when men and women identified more as tribal and not as racial. Modern DNA studies have shown that not all ethnic groups are these distinct pure breeds as they think they are. And in the earliest of time, different communities intermarried and interbred and produced distinct groups via different migratory patterns. This has been labeled as genetic admixture. Let us give two examples. In Somalia in Northeast Africa, whose coasts run into the Indian Ocean, we see some early traces of genetic admixture. In the 19th century saw the advent of photography, and some of the early pictures captured were of Somalian people by the photographer Prince Roland Bonaparte at an exhibition in Paris, France. They are traditionally a semi-nomadic people who have similar attire to other African nations, and most are Sunni Muslim. And when you carefully look at these early black and white photos of them, some have very woolly hair and look distinctly black African, and others look like Afro-Arabs with very straight noses. And as you carefully look at the people of Somalia scattered throughout the West after their domestic war in these different news reports, they are of different shades of brown. Some are light and some are very dark, with a different hair texture and even different facial features, which shows the many different varieties of their appearances. Modern DNA studies have shown that they are a genetic admixture, an amalgamation of two different ethnic groups. For the 1973 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica said that the Somali peoples are classed largely on linguistic grounds as Southeastern Kushites or Hamites. Physically, they are very tall and handsome, often quite dark-skinned in color, and many have facial characteristics that suggest an Arab or Semitic strain. This was confirmed by blood group studies. East Africans, according to the New York Times, retain ancestry from the first farmers of the southern Levant. The Levant is the eastern Mediterranean region of Western Asia that includes present-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and most of Turkey. In Somalia, where senior men put henna in their beds to make it orange, a third of people's DNA comes from there. So here is one example of genetic admixture. The Armenian Mountains in Asia Minor was the very first migratory pattern for early man, according to the book of Genesis. And over the years, it has been a crossroads for many different groups where they would meet and also intermarry. In the 19th century, the early photographers also captured the community of people who called themselves Armenians, who apparently have the oldest Christian nation or community in the world. And as you can see, some can pass as white Europeans, and others have a very dusky brown Asiatic appearance. The few artifacts we have of Armenians shows them with a Eurasian look, with a type of tanned skin, where a number of Armenian kings once ruled in that region. And today, if you look at Armenian people, many do have that very distinct dusky or brown Eurasian appearance with that distinct dark brown hair. And modern DNA studies have also confirmed that, like the people of Somalia, they are also a product of genetic admixture. A historian, when describing them, wrote that so many races from ancient times, the late George Rawlinson said, found a refuge in the Armenian fortresses, that we can well understand the original ethnic character of the true Armenians having been submerged and lost before the rise of literature, or at any rate of that literature which has come down to us. According to the New York Times, it documented that geneticists have scanned the genomes of 173 Armenians from Armenia and Lebanon and compared those of 78 other populations from around the world. They found that Armenians are a mix of ancient populations whose descendants now live in Sardinia, Central Asia, and several other regions. This formative mixture occurred from 3000 to 2000 BC, the geneticists calculated, coincident with Moses Koronatzi's date for the founding of Armenia. So early man, when he crisscrossed and explored different frontiers and terrains in Afro-Eurasia and other parts of the world, intermarried with different communities, and the racial attitudes that are deeply embedded in our minds today did not exist in the ancient world. So what happened? What went wrong? Thousands of years ago, people could marry and integrate and there was no problem. Today, there are people who are suffering from an identity crisis. But what is more sad is that the church is the most racially divided institution on earth, the very system that is meant to be an example to the world. What happened? Every tribe, nation, or race of human being is created in the image of God and has his or her own unique and distinct features. If the narrator has not said it already, he will say it again. Wouldn't life be very boring if everybody looked exactly the same? But sadly, in the real world we live in today, these differences are an issue. Where do these prejudices come from? When a baby is inside of its mother's womb, totally ignorant of the outside world and totally dependent on its mother's diet, is it learning to love or to hate? What about when a mother is bonding with its brand newborn child? Is she teaching it to hate or to love in those crucial and early years of nurturing? Fathers have the most important roles, for their bond with their children is the greatest influence on a child's behavior. And if they are born into a household of faith and taught properly, it can also affect how a child perceives God. They can either end up loving God or hating Him if there is not the right balance. In the ideal world, the greatest experience in your life that should set you up for the future is the innocence of childhood. And your home environment and even your community should never suppress a child's development for learning. For children are very curious from birth, and the time and care you give them as a parent will have a major impact on their socio-emotional and intellectual growth and development. So if we are all created in the image of God with our own unique features, then why do people hate each other so badly and will even kill if someone looks different to them? Let us try to get to the root of the problem. In East Asia, in the Northwest Pacific Ocean, are a string of 5 islands that have been called Japan. It is one of those many countries in Asia that has still preserved its many traditions, especially in its art and in its architecture. During 16th century feudal Japan, when many clans were fighting for dominance, one man attempted to unite all the warring factions. His name was Oda Nobunaga, a Japanese general and statesman. His great wealth financed his conquests, but there was one man who assisted him in his military feats, and there has been a recent keen interest in this mysterious and interesting figure. He was given the name of Yasuke, and this 6'2" very built black African who towered over your average Japanese was so highly respected that he became Oda Nobunaga's retainer, right-hand man, and was trained as the first ever foreign samurai warrior. Even though some Japanese thought he was either a demon or a god, in 16th century feudal Japan there was no issue of race. People were just curious about each other's differences. But today in Japan, people who are categorized as a hafu, who are either half Japanese and half other, are made to feel like outsiders in their own country of birth. What has happened since 16th century feudal Japan? Look at all these different people with all of their differences in skin tones and fashion. Some look like they are from China, and others look like they are from Africa. But for thousands of years they've all lived in the same country, and guess where they all live? In India, a place that has always had a history of a diverse mixture of different peoples. In the 17th century, men like Sultan Muhammad Shah of Deccan in southern India, who is seated, had black African couriers in his court, who are standing on the far left. And in another painting on cloth, dated to around 1650, it depicts the military procession of Golconda court of Abdullah Qutub Shah, also in the Deccan province of South India. Among this military pageantry in India of flags, elephants and incense burners, he is also surrounded by very dark-skinned black African soldiers just under the elephants. Black Africans and Indians were once very relaxed around each other with no hostilities, some blacks even becoming prominent courtiers in 17th century India. The most famous of these blacks was the Ethiopian-born Sidi military leader Malik Ambar, who became the prime minister of the Ahmada Nagar Sultanate in southern India. This military leader has a tomb in India erected in his honor, but there's also a painting of one of his nemesis, Jahangir, with an arrow to his severed head venting his hatred towards him. Why is that? Because this military leader built a system that ruined the game for Mughals in India, according to the Indian Express. But when famine struck colonial India in the 19th century, in one of the least documented and known episodes of colonial history, between 1834 and 1920, approximately 1,500,000 indentured laborers of whom 85% were from India, were sent to British colonies, another form of slavery, to build up the economic interests of the British Empire. 1/3 to Mauritius, 1/3 to the British West Indies, and the rest to KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. The British used clever advertising strategies and tactics to lure the Indians to travel into these colonies, and this interaction between blacks and Indians, who were both working as labourers for the British government, created a deep-rooted hostility between them both that has still created a deep distrust and even a hatred between both communities to this very day. Now, some have intermarried, more so in the British West Indies section of the Caribbean, and their offspring have been given the Caribbean Hindustani name of Dogla, which means mixed. Others in British Guyana have tried to heal these black Indian rifts, but the powers that shouldn't be, the CIA, have sadly provoked these divisions and created more of a deep gulf. What is even more sad is that these rifts have also been carried into the churches of people who profess to be Christians, and the narrator has been confronted a number of times by different people who have asked, why is your church so racially divided? But these are only modern day divisions. When you go back to the Middle Ages, on a very colourful map titled the Catalan Atlas, made from vellum leaves and dated to 1375 AD, you can see Afro-Eurasians all represented. There is Marco Polo, the Italian explorer, and his entourage, a monarch from Asia, and the man who has been called the richest man who have ever lived, the West African king Mansa Musa. This painting shows the procession of Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor English monarch. She formed an Anglo-Moroccan alliance to protect her borders from outside invaders from Spain, and she also made jewelry with the face of a black African on it. You see, racism was not yet an issue. She was succeeded by King James VI of Scotland, the first of England, and in the 17th century, at the same time, the Chinese had the Ming monarchical dynasty, and King Garcia II of the Congo was one of many African kings who also ruled in the 17th century. There was no superior race ideology. Ambassadors were sent to different regions. An English ambassador to Brussels, whose face is clean-shaven, wears a wig, a walking stick, a sword in his side, and clothed in a buttoned overcoat, a waistcoat and breeches, and shoes. A Turkish ambassador from the Ottoman Empire to Brussels is also fully bearded, has a turban, a knife in his waist, wore an inner robe and an outer robe called a kaftan, baggy trousers called salva, and boots. And a Congolese ambassador to Dutch Brazil, who is clean-shaven, barefoot, has a colourful mopu cap on his head, jewelry around his neck, and draped with a robe-like clothing called a wrapper. No one was superior, and each continent was sophisticated in the arts. King Charles is beautifully carved into stone. A monarch from Bhutan in Asia is beautifully carved into his likeness. And in the West African culture of Benin, it also depicted its own people in naturalistic art in a metallic style called lost wax casting. They also depicted the Europeans, the Portuguese, in both metal and ivory, who they traded with. And as you can clearly see, there was no such thing as racism. But something happened that was to change the game forever. And we will briefly cover an episode of human history that still affects how races relate to each other today. When the European nations began to navigate and dominate the global sea lanes, when they were not brutally fighting among themselves, they were extending their power base. In London's Victoria and Albert Museum, there are busts of the Spanish Habsburg monarch, King Charles V, and he wanted to expand Spanish rule. And the culture in Central America, that was one of the most mathematically sophisticated erected forms of architecture on earth, was about to be transitioned into New Spain in the 16th century. And the infamous Aztec culture in Mexico was about to come to a close. The Inca culture of Peru was also to meet its end when Spain dominated what is now called Spanish-speaking Ibero or Latin America. And Hollywood has continued to expound the Catholicized view of history, which is the demonization of the natives of Mexico and portraying them as savages as a justification of the brutality of Spanish rule. Many have been clueless on why there are many terror attacks taking place in France. But those who understand history know that it is connected to the unhealed wounds of French colonialism. When France lost its economic prize in Haiti, to continue to finance its government, they occupied Indochina, that included the countries of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia that grew rubber to boost its economy. They also controlled large portions of Africa in the north, in the Sahara and in the west. And if you want to know why they are in the Sahel, it is not to fight Islamic extremists, but for its natural resources. That is the whole aim of Western expansion. It is solely economic in its nature. For when the British monarch Queen Victoria died in 1901, 1/4, that is 25% of the world's population, was under British rule. And while we can spend forever talking about the English occupation of the planet, we will only look at their role in the Middle East. When Britain controlled the Arab world after World War I, it did meet resistance in countries like Yemen, who hated British rule. And while many may think this is a history lesson of the Cold War, the country that has an ongoing war, cholera, famine, COVID, and the worst humanitarian disaster in the world, has not only had its foreign aid cut from Britain, which is wickedness, but the UK is supplying the arms to the Saudis to kill more innocent civilians, and there are over 80 companies in more than 350 locations in the UK who have given military support to Saudi Arabia. While the Anglo-Saxon English-speaking world is passing laws to protect its recently erected war monuments, it has and is still doing far more damage outside of its own protected borders. For throughout the 21st century, the Western world's global war on terror that has fueled ethnic and religious divisions, created draconian laws, terrorized the Middle East, and has been destroying much older monuments and cultures that go further back into antiquity solely for the natural resources which has stayed its foreign policy. It is continuing the mandate of colonial times that has sadly psychologically damaged for life many of the military personnel in the West.
We try and say that we're there to help and the Taliban are bad, but if we go in and we start destroying infrastructure or destroying their private vehicles and burning down their homes, it doesn't really send the right message.
So what has been the effects of the nations of Western Europe occupying other people's lands and expanding their empires? Out of it came colonialism, which, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is the policy of maintaining colonies with the exploitation of backward or weak peoples, and racism, which is the belief in the superiority of a particular race. So if you're unaware why the generation of today who are of mixed heritage are having an identity crisis, modern studies are confirming that its roots can be traced right back to the days of colonialism in the 19th to 20th century, for they never had these issues prior. As many in the West are becoming aware that people are studying what really took place in the past, they're becoming very, very defensive. And as you can clearly see, it is the media that cleverly provokes the race issue, giving whites this idea that they are this new persecuted minority group. What people are unaware of is that they are the ones who dominate journalism and influence public opinion. But this still has not stopped people in believing that they have to fight to reclaim this lost European identity and give people the impression that darker-skinned so-called minority groups are going to take over the Europeans' power base and reverse the racism. This has also led to a number of individuals who are trying to intellectually reclaim their so-called dying culture. And what is even more interesting is that men in both the Christian church and in the secular world sound exactly the same when they play victim in order to save what they would consider their lost Euro-American heritage.
Whites are miserable racists. Race is a myth. We are all the same, so we should relax and enjoy giving our country away.
Men, turn if you would in your Bible to Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10. The title of my sermon this morning is Being White is Not a Crime. being white is not a crime.
Anyone who understands the clever maneuvering of the political game of chess knows that there are many pawns who are being used to stoke the race issue. But this idea that whites are this persecuted minority is a very clever distraction. The New York Times in the last 4 years have documented in detail who really control the different departments in the world's largest economy that influences the rest of the world. And even though America is becoming more racially diverse, whites control everything. They are top of the 25 most valued companies. They're the head of the top universities that influence how people think. They dominate the fashion industry, what TV shows and Hollywood films people watch, the music that is both produced and played, both the books and the magazines that people read, and the laws in the US Senate. For the Senate is 80% white and male and 92% Christian. They dominate Wall Street and the entire modern tech industry. And as you carefully look through the entire Anglo-Saxon English-speaking world, they dominate everything, and the higher echelons know this. But many in the West fail to recognize what has been done in the past and its effects it has had on the world today. And you sadly have to go back to ancient Greece to re-educate this modern generation of what are the dangers of colonialism. In a book titled The History of the Peloponnesian War, written in the 5th century BC by the Greek Athenian historian Thucydides, who is credited as being the pioneer and father of scientific history and the school of political realism, he documented the dangers of imperialism and the lasting effect it has on those who have been conquered and who are treated unfairly. When you read a portion of it, you can clearly understand the debates that are taking place in the world today. He said, "Personally, I've had occasion often enough already to observe that a democracy is incapable of governing others. What you do not realize is that your empire is a tyranny exercised over subjects who do not like it and who are always plotting against you. You will not let them obey you by injuring your own interests in order to do them a favor. Your leadership depends on superior strength and not on any goodwill of theirs. And this is the very worst thing, to pass measures and then not abide by them." As people are earnestly searching for the truth, there are many hidden gems that are tucked away in long-lost works and forgotten manuscripts that are just waiting to be rediscovered. And there have been a few rare Western writers who have both bravely and unconsciously documented the horrors of Western colonialism. The 19th century Scottish prophetic writer Alexander Keith, in his Signs of the Times, said that the continental nations of Europe had colonies in every quarter of the globe, and thither the ravages of war were carried. In achieving this conquest and sustaining the empire of the sea, the blood of thousands and tens of thousands was poured out like water, and their bleeding bodies cast out into the deep. The tonnage, the rate, the caliber, the shot, the expenditure may be reckoned, but who can tell the amount of blood that was shed? An editor for London's Financial Times newspaper 2 centuries later wrote an article in March 2020 explaining the damaging effects of colonialism. The piece was titled "Britain's Colonial Crimes Come Back to Haunt Trade Negotiations," and he so eloquently said that in Britain, America and most of Europe, and highlighted in red, it is exceedingly rare for people to learn about colonial history unless they specialize in it at university. It is surprising how few Western diplomats are aware of their own country's troubled legacies. Only when armed with historical facts and an understanding of this nuance can, number 1, Western diplomats, number 2, scholars, and number 3, business people develop the empathy needed to navigate the minefield of historical grievances in former colonies. So true.
In effect, the United States created ISIS. Nothing like it existed before the American occupation. We created it. It's ours. And now we're trying to deal with the consequences.
When the narrator was a very young child, he always had a very deep curiosity on how systems worked and why do certain ethnic groups act and behave a specific way. So he would mix with different communities to learn from them, and he also acquired a deep thirst for collecting books. In 1997, while studying media, he purchased a book titled Anthropology and Photography that showed how the power of photography, beginning in the 19th century, has been used to manipulate how we view the world. He purchased another book in 2004 titled The Missionaries by the late Guardian journalist Geoffrey Morehouse that detailed that the Western churches in the 19th century played a very central role in colonialism, dividing tribes, manipulating kings and chiefs, and also endorsed the spread of the westernized racism that their governments were promoting that still affects communities to this day. And more recently, in a book titled The Archaeology of Race, on pages 48 and 49, it documents 4 very important events that took place in different parts of the world in the middle of the 19th century. And in response, men in England in the late Victorian and early Edwardian period would misuse both biology and theology and create racist ideas in a reaction to those events that sadly still influences how people treat each other. Let us briefly analyze these 4 separate events. The Republic of India is geographically situated in South Asia and is the second most populated country on earth after China. But before its independence in 1948, it was once ruled by a chartered company that built most of London's docklands and invented corporate lobbying. Between 1600, when it was founded, and before it was dissolved in 1874, it was once the world's most powerful company that once ruled the waves, known as the original corporate raiders, who became the world's most powerful business. It had its own private armies all over the globe that were trained in the UK, that was twice the size of Britain's standing army. It had its own territory, coins, ships, a flag, a coat of arms. It was an empire within an empire that was responsible for half of global trade in the 1700s and 1800s, that included the profits of the slave trade and the opium wars in China. In 1757, it controlled the entire Mughal state of Bengal and 3/4 of India. But the following century, in 1857, an uprising of a large section of Muslims and Hindus in the Bengal army in the north of India worked together to shut out the monopoly of this chartered business. The Sikhs, on the other hand, stayed loyal to the British colonialists. It was one of the first wars in the world to be caught on camera that lasted for a year. It has been given many different titles: the Indian Mutiny, Sepoy War, Revolt of 1857, the Uprising of 1857, the Rebellion of 1857, the Great Rebellion, or the First Indian War of Independence. The narrator is very, very limited in his knowledge of this episode of Indian history, for there are many conflicting positions. But the little that he does know is that it was an uprising against British rule managing the affairs of the Indian continent. It was eventually crushed by the British Army with the arrest of the last Mughal, but it sent shockwaves throughout colonial Britain. This was the first event that shaped colonial attitudes on race. The second one still affects us all to this very day, and it started 3 years after the end of the Indian Mutiny.
That over 600,000 Americans died, white Americans died, in order to end slavery and to free the slaves from bondage. The slaves who were imported into the United States were sold to slavers at that time.
The Civil War was to try to preserve the Union.
And racial...
You're incredible. You're incredible with your history. You don't understand history. You don't know the history of this country. And therefore you sit there and you make assertions as if somehow you got some historical viewpoint that is very telling. The fact is the Civil War was fought to preserve the Union, and it was simply that slavery was a question within that preservation. It was not a war to free the slaves. As Lincoln would say, if he could preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do that. That was his comment. That was his quote, quote unquote.
Jeans trousers are probably the most popular worn item of casual fashion clothing in the Western world that first became popularized in the 1960s. The products that are used to make jeans are the indigo dye that gives the denim that blue color, and the materials wool and cotton. But in order for the cotton to be produced, it had to be grown on plantations, and it needed some unpaid labor. And the people who were driving the US economy throughout most of the 19th century were the cotton-picking black African slaves. Many blacks took up arms in a response to their influential comrades and joined the fight in that very bloody 4-year Civil War struggle, for they knew, like their black African neighbors in Haiti, that their future freedom depended on the outcome of that war. Why was it so pivotal for them to fight? There was a perfectly good reason, for slavery was North America's first big business. Recent studies have confirmed that before the Civil War, roughly 50% of the wealth in the antebellum South was held in slaves. And by 1860, the nearly 4 million American slaves were worth some $3.5 billion, making them the largest single financial asset in the entire US economy, worth more than all manufacturing and railroads combined. Just before the Civil War, North America was exporting roughly 60 to 75% of the world's cotton, which was at that time the equivalent of oil today, and there was one nation that depended upon it to help run its economy: Britain. The cotton famine in Britain that led to the closure of cotton mills in Lancashire, and that cost 500,000 people their livelihoods in the north of England, was as a result of the Union in the north blockading southern ports to stop the Confederacy from exporting cotton that would weaken the southern economy in the United States. Liverpool in Merseyside, England was pro-Confederate, and many historians have said that this is where the US Civil War actually ended. The London Guardian records that Liverpool was a city that was made wealthy by cotton imports, and there were many Britons who fought in the war, some in the north and some in the south, but most of the Southern Confederacy's arms came from Britain, as documented in a previous study. In London's Kensal Green Cemetery, there is buried a man named Charles Coon Priolo. His tombstone reads that he was born in South Carolina and died in London, and the London Guardian documents that he bankrolled the Confederates in the American Civil War. Why? Charles Coon Priolo, it records, was, and highlighted in red, a cotton merchant born in Charleston, South Carolina, was based in Liverpool during the war from 1861 to 1865. His efforts began as an attempt to save his business when the cotton trade, crucial to the economy both of the southern states of America and the Lancashire mill owners, collapsed. So when Jefferson Davis, who has a huge monument erected in his honor, who owned a cotton plantation of slaves and was a former US Secretary of War, led the secession of the 11 southern states that led to the US Civil War, it was solely economic. But when the US Civil War ended in 1865, another revolt was taking place in that same year by a close neighbor, and this was the third event.
Born a slave in Jamaica.
Look how adorable the little one is.
Taken from my mama. My missus called me Marguerite, but my true name be July.
Slavery, a dreadful evil, will be finally abolished.
In a section of the Caribbean called the British West Indies, there is an island that still has preserved the name of the indigenous Amerindian Taino people gave it, the Iraq name of Examaica, that means a land of streams and wood. Today the anglicized pronunciation is used, Jamaica. Like most of the surrounding Caribbean islands, it has breathtaking scenery and some of the most beautiful sights of nature. But underneath the tropical beauty, there is a very troubled history that the island has still never recovered from, that can be traced right back to its not so long ago era of plantocracy. As the US Civil War was coming to a close in 1865, the dire socio-economic conditions of Jamaica was building up to what was one of the last of the insurrections on that island. It has been labelled as the Morant Bay Uprising of 1865, and the main players in this drama was Edward John Eyre, an English explorer, an unrepentant devout Anglican, son of a clergyman, and the colonial governor of Jamaica. The right excellent George William Gordon, the bespectacled illegitimate son of a Scottish white planter and slave woman, who was a self-educated wealthy businessman, landowner, magistrate and politician, a radical critic of the colonial government who was a Presbyterian turned Baptist and was a vestryman for the parish of St. Thomas, and his friend Paul Bogle, an energetic leader and a radical activist who championed the cause of the very extremely poor peasants and small farmers, who was a Baptist deacon in the native Baptist church at Stony Gut in Morant Bay, with the character of an African chief, and the woman whose cold advice lit the fuse that led to the insurrection, Queen Victoria. Let us get a background to this very little known insurrection in a former British colony. On the 22nd of June 1948, a ship docked at Tilbury in Essex in the southeast of England. The ship was called the Empire Windrush, and most of the passengers on board were immigrants from Jamaica and other Caribbean islands. Many other Caribbean islanders followed decades after and have also settled into Britain to rebuild the country after the Second World War. But since their arrival, there has always been some very troubling underlying issues. The London Guardian document that recently declassified files have shown that they were unfairly targeted by the English police in the 1950s. And in London's Financial Times in January 2021, we can see that nothing really has changed. The system still functions exactly the same. This photo shows a West Indian man being stopped and searched in Notting Hill in West London in 1958 by London's Metropolitan Police. 2 generations later, in a global lockdown, their grandchildren are going through the exact same experience. Even though they make up just 3% of the UK population, blacks are still the highest to get stopped and searched by the police. Now, the narrator is in no way excusing the criminal activity of these youth, but we have to carefully analyse how the British state unfairly targets the Windrush generation's descendants and sets them up to fail if they do not have the right home environment or a community support network to protect them from being a statistic. Let us get to the bottom of this, for its roots can be traced right back to the slave plantations. In a report titled Young Black People and the Criminal Justice System, published in the year 2007, the UK government openly tells the public that black youth are deliberately targeted and criminalized. This is what a portion of it says. From the 1970s, highlighted in blue, the black immigrants suffered public stigma driven by adverse media attention, which labeled the community as overrun with pimps and drugs. So the media swayed public opinion. In 84.7% of offences in 2004 to 2005 involving young offenders aged 10 to 17, the young people involved classified their ethnicity as white. Now, if over 80% of the UK population are of white European descent, according to the data, where they make up a majority in every part of the UK as highlighted in yellow, then it should not be surprising that in the areas that they dominate, you'll have the highest levels of crime. That is a bit of common sense that includes the most murderous place in the UK, Boston, Lincolnshire, that has a predominantly white population. In 2003 to 2004, 92% of black people aged 10 to 17 were not subject to the disposals in the youth justice system. However, statistics show that young black people are overrepresented at all stages of the criminal justice system. As a group, they are more likely to be stopped and searched by the police, less likely to be given unconditional bail, and more likely to be remanded in custody than white offenders. Young black people and those of mixed ethnicity are likely to receive more punitive sentences than young white people. And it concluded that while the actual numbers of black people entering the criminal justice system are small in relation to the figures for white young people, the proportion of young black people coming into the system is unacceptable. These are the very words of the British government. So a system wants to perpetuate a stigma. But what exactly led the first influx of West Indians to migrate to the UK in 1948 to meet heavy opposition not only by the MPs but also by the deep-rooted racism inside of the churches, where they are still, to this very day, heavily segregated in the UK. 3 years prior, in 1945, the British government published a report detailing the very poor economic conditions in the British West Indies. It was a continuation of another report in 1897 that was never published, that was saying the exact same thing. In the archives of the US Library of Congress, Moses Shepherd, a Quaker abolitionist, published a report in 1854 that described the ill treatment of black slaves in Jamaica. And in 1789, a Jamaica planter presented a report to the British House of Commons, basically saying the exact same thing. And also in that same year, on this road in central London, Riding House Street, a man was also documenting his accounts of what he also saw in Jamaica. And Olaudah Equiano has been credited as the pioneer of the abolition movement in Britain during slavery, where he petitioned his work to the then British Queen Charlotte Sophia of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the wife of King George III. And in this very powerful autobiography, he wrote what he saw as a free slave. He said that, "I found Jamaica to be a very fine, large island, well peopled, and the most considerable of the West India Islands. There were a vast number of Negroes here, whom I found, as usual, exceedingly imposed upon by the white people, and the slaves punished as in the other islands. I saw many cruel punishments inflicted on the slaves in the short time I stayed there. There are Negroes whose business it is to flog slaves." For those around the world who are unfamiliar with this episode of human history, the narrator will give a quick analysis. The continent of Europe, and in this section we will be focusing on the British, and the continent of Africa were to shape the direction of the modern world in what is known as the largest human migration program in recorded history, where 2 races of people were to repopulate the Americas and change the demographics. English writers H.G. Wells, seated, Edward Gibb John Beddoe on the right, all documented that the people who have populated the British Isles over thousands of years are an amalgamation of many different European tribes, and recent studies have shown that their descendants, the Irish, along with the English and Scots, owned the majority of Jamaica's 600 sugar plantations, and of course the estimated 200 slaves of African origin on each one. Ships sailed from British ports to Africa, the late Dr. Eric Williams said, and the importation into Jamaica from 1700 to 1786 was 610,000. An Angolan Negro was a proverb for worthlessness. Coromantians, or the Ashantis from the Gold Coast in Ghana, where most Jamaicans descended from, were good workers but too rebellious. Mandingos from Senegal were too prone to theft. The Igbos of Nigeria were timid and despondent, and the Paupers or Widers from Dahomey in modern-day Benin were the most docile and best possessed. Some of the worst abuses in the plantations, as Olaudah Equiano observed, were by blacks who were instructed by whites to brutally punish their own people, but they were only mimicking what they saw the white plantation owners do to blacks. The plantation owners also created a strategy to turn blacks on each other by creating a black middle class, people who were Europeanized, polished and re-educated to shun anything that was from Africa, and a West Indian regiment where 7% of blacks were released from slavery and intelligently trained to turn on their own blacks who got out of line. They also created ideologies to justify their brutalities in the plantations, even abusing the Bible, where men like Thomas Goodwin, Bishop Thomas Newton and Peter Helene were advocates of the curse of Ham theory that taught that the Atlantic slave trade was justified because Noah cursed Ham, but the Bible actually said curse be to Canaan and not Ham. Samuel Sewall, a judge, businessman and printer in the Massachusetts Bay Province, published an essay titled The Selling of Joseph in 1700, strongly criticizing the slave trade, and he skillfully and intelligently counteracts each one of their arguments using both intelligence and scripture. but he was a very rare lone voice in that time period, for men like Edward Long, an English-born pro-slavery colonial administrator in Jamaica, published a 3-volume set in 1774 titled History of Jamaica, where he separated blacks from the rest of mankind and compared them to monkeys. 3 centuries later, this plantation idea has spread throughout the earth, for when black footballers play on the pitch, they have bananas thrown at them to dehumanize them and to compare them to monkeys. Some players eat them and say that it tastes very nutritious. On the official BBC website, it shows a black child alongside a toy chimpanzee. Interesting. The late Ronald Reagan saw blacks as monkeys. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy sees blacks as monkeys. British TV host Alistair Stewart compared blacks to apes. A US TV anchor compares her co-host to a gorilla. A Romanian TV host calls Serena Williams a monkey. Roseanne Barr not once, but twice compares 2 black members of the US government to an ape. The former mayor of Liverpool compared black people to monkeys. In Asia, a chief rabbi in Israel calls black people monkeys. In the Arab Muslim world, they view blacks as monkeys. A Chinese businessman in Kenya calls the president and the civilians monkey people. And Bollywood star Isha Gupta compares a black footballer to a gorilla. This photo is of a human zoo in 1897 where 267 black Africans from the Congo were taken to King Leopold II country estate in Belgium in Western Europe to be put on display like animals. And in the center of them is a man who is overseeing them in this exhibition, a member of the church. And one of the reasons why Otto Benga was taken from the Congo and was on display alongside a chimpanzee in a zoo in New York in 1906 is because they saw the example that was first being laid out by the church. So since slavery, when they tried to view blacks as the missing link between monkey and man, its effects are still very well with us to this very day, and the narrator has observed that westernized racism was created in these slave plantations by white Europeans in order to justify dehumanizing black Africans so that they could continue to expand and monopolize their economic interests without feeling any sense of guilt or shame. It was during the reign of the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell in 1655 that Jamaica officially became a British colony. He was protecting Protestant Britain against the papacy, but profiting from the slave trade. The Church of England and the Bank of England, recent studies have shown, both admitted that they both profited well from the slave trade. How did the first railway system in the world get started that connected London to the north in England? It was financed by former slave owners who put money into the Great Western Railway, according to the Financial Times. And as you go around the UK, there are a few monuments, some taken down, of people who profited from slavery. One of the least known figures is the Anglo-Irish naturalist physician Hans Sloane. Both the Natural History Museum and the British Library were once a part of the British Museum. The British Museum was founded on Hans Sloane's vast collections he acquired when he was, guess where, in Jamaica. But his vast collections, as recent investigations have uncovered, were also founded on his connections to slavery. Throughout the British Isles, English Lord Mayor and Member of Parliament William Beckford, Welshman Richard Pennant, the first Baron Penrhyn, and a member of the House of Commons, and Scotsman Captain John Wedderburn, who was the largest landowner in Jamaica, all owned slaves and plantations in Jamaica. And also the people from the Emerald Isle, the Irish, both Catholic and Protestant, also profited from the Atlantic slave trade as recently documented in the Times. But today's revisionists are cleverly restructuring history, covering up their past horrors and presenting Europeans as the true liberators of the slaves. In a well-preserved tomb in London's Kensal Green Cemetery, it has engraved on it the name of Howe Peter, the Marquis of Sligo, who was the Irish-born colonial governor of Jamaica. Modern-day biographers are praising him as the true liberator of the black African slaves in Jamaica, when slavery was so-called abolished in the British West Indian slave plantations in 1833-4 under his watch.
Evil. And so if somebody came along and said, you know, I don't think it's necessarily right that the West invented slavery. In fact, the West, everyone had slavery at one time. And in fact, Britain and America were the pioneers of getting rid of slavery. This is historical fact.
They hope to gain their freedom. I'm going to give it to them.
The man who gives victory in battle is prized beyond every other man.
This Hollywood style of storytelling that the US Congressional Policy Advisor also tried to pull off when describing the US Civil War can be first traced back to the 19th century Oxford professor James Anthony Froude that continued with Sir Reginald Copeland, the English historian and Bate Professor of Colonial History at the University of Oxford, which is the classical school of British historical writing that propounds the racial explanation of history, where the European is always presented as the true hero and the savior of all mankind. But what really led to the abolition of the slave trade? The New Yorker, an American weekly magazine in January 2020, when describing slavery in Jamaica, said that for much of the 18th century, Jamaica was the most profitable colony and the largest importer of enslaved Africans. The historian Vincent Brown argues that these slave rebellions did more to end the slave trade than any actions by white abolitionists. The revolt that ended slavery in Jamaica was by Samuel Sharp, who was ordained in the Baptist Church. What became known as the Baptist War led to the abolition of slavery everywhere in the British Empire in 1834. Jamaica is known for having the highest number of slave rebellions in the Western Hemisphere, and it was the Baptist Samuel Sharp that led what has been titled as the Baptist War in 1831 to 1832. That was an uprising due to the brutal conditions of slaves in sugar plantations in Jamaica. This also led to a very deep hatred for Baptists that was to cloud the judgment of the colonial government, that was to greatly affect the case of the last of the uprisings. There were also many runaway slaves who fled into the forest for freedom. Who were they? In the American business magazine Forbes, it also tells us that Leeward Maroons, descendants of West African slaves who fled harsh plantation conditions, and the indigenous Amerindians who they banded with, fighting colonists with guerrilla tactics such as camouflage and the secret language of the Abeng, a type of bugle made out of a cow horn used to blow coded messages. It was these tactics that eventually won the Maroons their freedom and their own sovereign lands. Jamaica's Okompo Maroons were the first free black people in the Western Hemisphere. Let us look at the events leading up to the Morant Bay Uprising in 1865. This painting shows a battle between the British and the Ashantis in the Gold Coast of Ghana in the Anglo-Ashanti War of 1824. The reason why the British lasted so long is because they received assistance from other African tribes which started during the slave trade that included men like the 18th century Ghanaian William Ansah, who sold his own people to the English. Wicked. His father was a Fante chief of Ghana that fought alongside the British to defeat the Ashantis in war in the 18th century. And while one set of Ashanti were fighting the British in Africa, at the exact same time their Ashanti brothers were also fighting the British in a slave uprising in Jamaica. It was known as Taki's Revolt, or the Coromantee War of 1760. But like Samuel Sharp's revolt, it was brutally crushed, not by British soldiers, but by blacks. The Maroons. The Maroons were at first warriors who fought against the British in bush warfare, and they outsmarted the British by using skills such as camouflage and the abeng, an instrument they inherited from Ghana, and preserving certain African words in the English patois like uno, njuk, adopi, jinal, aki, fufu, nyam, and anansi. When the British realized they could not win, Colonel John Guthrie on the left, a Jamaican plantation owner, and General Cudjoe on the right, leader of the Jamaican Maroons, exchanged hats, and in 1738 a peace treaty was signed between them. But there is always a divide and rule strategy by the British. The Maroons got their own land, but there was a catch. In return for these emoluments and privileges, the Maroons were not only to keep the peace toward King George II, his successors and their lieges, but also to kill or destroy all rebels against the British Crown in Jamaica and invaders of that dominion. This was how the Maroon Barons saw fealty in 1738. They became a sort of military police for the British to destroy their own blacks, and they were one of the most brutal killers during the Morant Bay Uprising. We have to have the right historical approach when looking at the Morant Bay Uprising in 1865. The mainstream modern white European academic approach, as has already been shown, has shifted from the ancient in-depth scientific Greek classical scholarship school of thinking of the 5th century BC historians Herodotus and Thucydides, that is based on the methods of close analyzation, observation, and remaining as neutral as possible. The psychology of modern European historiography is rooted in biasing and falsifying data with a very arrogant idea that because they are white, they have to be right, and they rewrite history and skillfully reshape the world into their paradigm, so that in the case of the Morant Bay Uprising, the white savior industrial complex is used to justify and cover up their past horrors, where Governor Eyre, who committed crimes against humanity, is presented as a hero. Many people of black African descent think that they were born into the wrong time, and they feel they have no place in the modern world. They make the grave mistake of looking at modern history from a pitiful victimhood approach, and they allow their emotions to override rational and critical thinking, and they miss out on important object lessons and facts, which is beneficial to their research, because they wallow in the pain of past injustices, and when you don't agree with them, they either start crying, label other blacks as sellouts, non-blacks as racists when others do not conform to their worldview. Blacks have the responsibility of writing their own history and teaching their own community their history with their own narratives, starting from the home, without making the fatal mistake of allowing mainstream Western scholars of doing it for them, as a white librarian schooled the narrator many years ago. The safest way to approach history is from reading the very records and documents of that specific time period, especially official state files, and closely analyzing the accounts of both sides, even if you don't agree, for they both come with their biases, and this will make you understand the past a lot more clearer. Though the narrator does not support these modern day protest movements, though he understands their frustrations, it is interesting that Bloomberg, that specializes in financial news, used the Morant Bay Uprising of 1865 as a model of the first modern protest movement. The Right Honourable Sidney Haldane Olivier, the British civil servant, a member of the cabinet of Ramsay MacDonald's Labour Party-led British government, and the governor of Jamaica from 1907 to 1913, saw the uprising as a justified cause, and was one of the only few Western writers who wrote a critical account of Governor Eyre's government and sympathised with the blacks of Jamaica in this very hard to obtain book. Let us now closely look at the facts at this very little known episode of modern history. In the 19th century, Edward Bean Underhill, a Baptist missionary, paid a visit to Jamaica and recorded his accounts of the island. He was appalled at what he saw, and he sent a letter or a telegram of urgency to the then Secretary of State of the British government, the Right Honourable Edward Cardwell, who was a friend of the missionary's father. He documented his experience in a book published in 1895 titled The Tragedy of Morant Bay, and he saw that conditions had not much changed since the abolition of slavery 3 decades earlier, and this is what he said. Since my visit to the island in 1859-60, I have felt the greatest interest in its prosperity and deeply grieve over the sufferings of its coloured population. Crime has fearfully increased. This arises from the extreme poverty of the people. The people then are starving. The taxation of the land is too heavy for its present resources. But the simple fact is, there is not sufficient employment for the people. There is neither work for them, nor the capital to employ them. Just over 100 years later, you would think that you are reading the exact same report in the year 1980. The two former slave islands that revolted against European rule were to be economically punished forever. And in Jamaica it was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, who was responsible for crippling Jamaica's economy, and Henry Kissinger. In a book titled Dope Inc., criticized as a conspiracy theory manual, it recorded in a chapter titled Jamaica and IMF that the island's currency was deliberately devalued by 30% in 1977 by the IMF. When Michael Norman Manley, Jamaica's then Prime Minister, was not playing ball with the global economic order, they decided to teach him a valuable lesson. Remember, as the narrator said, westernized racism is deeply rooted in economics. And as you carefully read the articles of the bitter struggle between the JLP and PNP parties in Jamaica in 1980, and the CIA's covert meddling in the country's politics, it sounds like the exact same conditions in the 1860s. The Washington Post said, Jamaica is in desperate financial straits. Now nearly bankrupt, the country is expected to default on its massive foreign debt. The unemployment and closed factories are impossible to ignore. The American difficulties with Jamaica began with, guess who? Henry Kissinger in 1975. Jamaica is beset by inflation that exacerbates the problem. The Jamaican populace is predominantly poor and working class, and from the bottom up. Poverty has always been known there.
The IMF loaned the Bank of Jamaica its central bank about $2.5 billion. The money came with conditions, among them freezing public sector salaries, higher income tax on the wealthy, and taxes on gasoline, cigarettes, alcohol, privatizing the seaports and airports.
Yes, so Jamaica's had shall we say, a tortured relationship with the IMF for most of our independent history.
But in less than 7 years, a remarkable thing has happened, says Finance Minister Nigel Clark.
Jamaica is has achieved record low unemployment. We've never had unemployment this low in our entire history.
Things have improved since then, but it still goes through its economic struggles. Edward Bean Underhill continues and said that I've seen men and women with looks of despair, having neither food nor clothing for their children. No relief was forthcoming from the government or legislator. These recently discovered photos from the Morant Bay files in Princeton University Library show that this man was not exaggerating in what he saw. The post-slavery economic conditions were real bad, as you can see from the attire of both young and old. And the economic conditions in the plantations were very, very dire. So the peasants and small farmers wrote a desperate plea in a letter to a woman in England who they thought would hear their cry, whose colossal statue still stands tall in London, England, the British monarch Queen Victoria. But her response emotionally broke them and discouraged them. As documented in this other book by the same Baptist historian, she told them if you just work harder, it will improve your position of poverty. What kind of foolishness is that? This letter obtained from the British colonial government documents the response of some of the Jamaicans, and the top name given among the four is of Paul Bogle. And if you carefully read and examine it closely, it is clear that men are reacting to an up-and-coming attack of the colonial government against them first. And Paul Bogle has been given an unfair trial of being labelled as a domestic terrorist, when he is not. The centre of the uprising was a small seaside town known as Morant Bay in the parish of St. Thomas in the east in the county of Surrey. Edward Bean Underhill said. The narrator has highlighted his words in gold for a reason. It must not be forgotten that blood was first shed by the authorities or the colonial government on the spot. The statements by Governor Eyre as to the terrible mutilations and atrocities alleged to have been perpetrated by the black people on the whites were proved to be unfounded. The brutalities and horrors which reminded Mr. Eyre of the Sepoy Mutiny, that was the first of the 3 revolts, were found to be purely imaginary, as were the vast number of plots and conspiracies which in their panic the governor and his advisers fancied were about them. Of the court-martial, the flimsiest evidence or no legal evidence at all, hundreds were put to death and with joke and shout led to execution. The homes of the peasantry for miles beyond the scenes of the disturbances were recklessly burnt and their contents destroyed. Women and children were sent adrift without clothing or food. Cruel scourgings, in some cases with piano wire twisted with cords, were freely inflicted. If they run, they are shot for running away. Women were not exempt from torture and insult. The number of persons killed by the rebels, as accurately ascertained by the Royal Commissioners, was in all 22, white and black. On the other hand, the Commissioners established the fact that at least 430 persons were shot or hung in retaliation during the existence of martial law. They declare that the punishment inflicted were indeed excessive, that many sufferers were entirely innocent of any crime whatever, that 1,000 dwellings were wantonly and cruelly burnt. The Morant Bay Uprising of 1865 and the response by the colonial government divided the British nation into 2 different camps. In Highgate Cemetery in North London, there is a grave of a man who is little known today unless you are studying British colonial or military history. His name was Sir Henry Knight Storks, and if you look closely and examine his headstone, it has his credentials engraved on it that reads, from the 5th line from bottom, that he was a Captain General of Jamaica in 1866. He received a despatch handed from the Secretary of State in that same year, and he was the one who oversaw the Royal Commission that documented the brutal atrocities of the colonial government against innocent civilians in Jamaica. And if you want to purchase a copy of that report, it is just over $500 on Abe Books. Interesting. In London's Embankment Gardens, there was a statue of the English philosopher and politician John Stuart Mill, the father of utilitarianism, a kind of neo-Gnostic free will postmodernistic idea. He headed the Jamaica Committee, which was a coalition of Victorian politicians, scientists, writers and abolitionists, who between 1866 to 1868 attempted to prosecute Governor Eyre for murder, but failed. Why? Because he was supported and was led off by men in very high places that included the colonial office that today is called the Foreign Office. Tory MP and former British Prime Minister of Italian Jewish descent, Lord Beaconsfield, better known as Benjamin Disraeli. The man whose house in the affluent area of Chelsea in London that has turned into a museum, who is still revered in aristocratic and literary circles, the Scottish historian and mathematician who was the mentor that inspired the philosophy of James Anthony Froude and strongly believed that blacks should be put back into slavery, Thomas Carlyle. And the man who is buried in Westminster Abbey, known as the greatest literary writer of Victorian Britain, Charles Dickens. These are a few of the photos of the people who lost their lives in the Morant Bay Uprising who were caught in the crossfire between the colonial government and the protesters, and the government response was very brutal. The British Army officer Luke Smith O'Connor, the man seated in the centre, President of the Privy Council of Jamaica, led and commanded the military assault during the Morant Bay Uprising. But what made his efforts more effective were the members of the West India Regiment, where in this photo he is seated on the far right and a black soldier stands above him. The Jamaican auxiliary and soldiers imported from Antigua and Barbados were to commit acts of brutality against their own people, and they were also assisted by another military unit. This letter is an exchange between Colonel Fife and Governor Eyre, and in this photo it is of Colonel Alexander Gordon Fife seated in the centre, a retired British officer of the 92nd Highlanders, and he is surrounded by 6 men who were devoted to him. The Maroons, a word that means wild. Before the US Navy SEALs and other military units in Eurasia wore camouflage in warfare, it was the Jamaican Maroons who first used camouflage in modern warfare, where they would cover themselves from head to foot in club moss and leaves and lay motionless for hours, where they were skilled in mountain warfare, tracking and hidden ambush, and the Jamaican people feared them for 2 reasons. They still practiced the old religion of Nimrod, Obeah, and they would brutally murder innocent individuals as a military unit for the British government. It was they who captured Paul Bogle. 2 centuries later, sadly today, the Jamaican law enforcement still continues the brutalities of the plantations and have been unable to fully shake off the inherited character of their former masters on how they treat their own people. And it sadly has a trickle-on down effect on the civilians, who reciprocate this behavior on innocent people, and have the highest homicide rate in the Latin America, Caribbean region. But it should be added, though many people do not want to admit it, there are outside influences that also greatly shape the violence that takes place in the island of Jamaica. On the British ship the HMS Wolverine, Governor Eyre sailed from St. Thomas to Kingston to capture his so-called chief culprit, an innocent Baptist who, under martial law, was guilty until proven guilty. This suspect was handed over to Mr. Gordon Ramsay, a high-ranking British military officer, the Provost Marshal of Morant Bay, known for his short fuse and brutality, who was also acquitted of murder. You can see the dark coldness in his harsh stare. The bodies of those individuals who were killed by the government were buried in an unmarked grave, and Colonel Thomas Hobbs, who eventually committed suicide, received a message of the lynchings in Morant Bay, where J. Elkington told him that Nelson is at Port Antonio hanging like fun by court-martial. I hope you'll not send in any prisoners. Civil law can do nothing. This drawing from that time shows the hangings in Morant Bay, and this poster from 1866, the year after the uprising, by the Anti-Slavery Society in England declared George William Gordon as innocent. The hangings were overseen by Lieutenant General Sir Alexander Abercrombie Nelson, who, like Governor Eyre and Mr. Ramsay, was also acquitted of his crime and given 2 more prominent roles in the military. In the UK, the highest judge in the land, Sir Alexander James Edmund Cockburn, read the evidence, and this was his conclusion when he read the Royal Commission and other case reports. Lord Chief Justice Cockburn says in his charge to the grand jury in the case of General Nelson and Lieutenant Brand, when these gentlemen were indicted for the murder of Mr. Gordon, said, "I cannot withhold from your attention the extraordinary character of the evidence and inconclusiveness and moral worthlessness of the evidence upon which Mr. Gordon was convicted. Contrary alike to the practice and justice of English law, there cannot be the slightest doubt, according to all the rulers of law, military or ordinary, that the great bulk of the evidence in which Mr. Gordon was convicted was inadmissible." 1 hour before George William Gordon was to be hanged, he wrote this very moving letter to his wife, where there is no bitterness or hatred he has for his captors. "My beloved Lucy," he said, "General Nelson has just been kind enough to inform me that the court-martial on Saturday last has ordered me to be hung, and that the sentence is to be executed in an hour hence, so that I shall be gone from this world of sin and sorrow. I do not deserve this sentence, for I never advised or took part in any insurrection. All I ever did was recommend the people who complained to seek redress in a legitimate way, and if in this I erred or have been misrepresented, I do not think I deserve the extreme sentence. It is, however, the will of my Heavenly Father that I should suffer in obeying His commands to relieve the poor and the needy, and to protect as far as I am able the oppressed. And glory be to His name, and I thank Him that I suffer in such a cause. Glory be to God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I can say that it is a great honor thus to suffer, for the servant cannot be greater than his Lord. I thought His Excellency the Governor would have allowed me a fair trial if any charge of sedition or inflammatory language were partly attributed to me, but I have no power of control. May the Lord be merciful unto him. General Nelson, who has just come for me, has faithfully promised to let you have this. May the Lord bless him, and the soldiers and all men, and may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with us all. Your trusted, devoted, and now nearly dying husband, George W. Gordon. The powerful testimony of a completely innocent man, a faith which you just do not see today. This was the third event, and the fourth and the last one we will just very briefly touch on. In the south of mainland Australia is a country that has one of the saddest episodes of Western colonialism. The British colonists renamed it after two Dutchmen. It was first named after Dutchman Anthony van Diemen, Diemen's Land, and in 1856 it was renamed after Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, where it is today called Tasmania. In the Grant Museum of Zoology in central London, there are the remains in a cabinet of an animal that once roamed freely in Tasmania that has been titled the thylacine or the Tasmanian tiger. This is the last film footage of this creature. What happened to it? This painting best shows the indigenous inhabitants in their natural surroundings and in their native attire. They were a very peaceful, loving people, but when Europeans came to forcefully remove them off their land, they tried to defend their territory, and a bloody war kicked off by the invader and the original inhabitants, known today as the Black War, and they were sadly relocated off their land, and it was orchestrated by the Englishman on the right in this painting, George Augustus Robinson, and it was sadly the European diseases that started to greatly reduce the remaining population. There are a few photos that still remain that were taken of this now extinct race of people, and one of them was at a place called Oyster Cove. It was taken by Francis Russell Nixon, the first Anglican Bishop of Tasmania, and the look on their faces clearly shows the despair of these people. This photo is of 3 of the last full-blooded Tasmanians, and they were to meet the same fate of the indigenous Tasmanian tiger that was hunted by Europeans into extinction. They were both to be wiped off the face of the earth forever, and 3 papers document this. Flinders University in Adelaide, South Australia published a document in 2003 that recorded what they had to face when confronting British imperialism, and the words underlined in red says that anarchy prevailed and countless Tasmanian women were kidnapped as slaves and concubines by the sealers who pillaged, raped and murdered unchecked for more than 3 decades. The London Guardian in March 2020, when documented the fate of these people, also said that under the governor George Arthur, like Jamaica a couple of decades later, martial law was declared as the colony tried to rid itself, through war and highlighted in gold, ongoing massacres and poisonings, and later the absurdly ineffective black line of Tasmania's First Peoples. George Augustus Robinson, a self-styled missionary who took it upon himself to conciliate with the indigenous of Tasmania and to remove them off their land and herd them into an isolated place. In a book titled The Races of Men, published in 1850, the Scottish surgeon Dr. Robert Knox openly bragged about the extermination of the Aborigines of Tasmania so that Europeans could occupy new territory. He said, "What a field of extermination lies before the Saxon and Celtic race. Already, in a few years, we have already cleared Van Diemen's Land of every human Aboriginal. In Tasmania, he swept him, and at once entirely, from the land of his birth." So these are the four major events in the middle of the 19th century, and the English colonialists were to react to these wars and uprisings by developing the ideology of Western racism, where men in the most prestigious circles and academic positions in both the secular and religious world were to do something that was never done before in human history. They were to cleverly Europeanize the whole span of human history by falsely claiming that it was white Europeans who created every ancient civilization that ever existed to skillfully align this idea on their colonial model. But why should they do this? As men explore the oldest records of human communication preserved on rock art in caves, when closely observing these petroglyphs, archaeologists have observed that the continent of Europe has the highest number of cave paintings on Earth, whose depth, colour and precision in the deepest canopy still has not been matched to this very day. Most of them depict animals that now dwell in Africa and in parts of Asia, but once roamed in Europe until an unexplained climatic phenomenon, the Ice Age, froze them into extinction. They are the lion and the rhino. Europe, as shown in previous studies, has many firsts that includes the oldest farmer's plough discovered in Italy, the oldest ceramic art discovered in Moravia, the oldest sundial found in the Ukraine, the oldest gold collection discovered in Bulgaria, and the oldest known wooden wheel discovered in Slovenia. But not content with their own history, Europeans have attempted to hijack others. The man who was instrumental in marketing European superiority was an individual whose worldview was apparently shaped when he paid a visit to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, and he was spellbound and in awe by the different variety of animals that he saw there. And though raised in a religious environment, he had an apparently crisis of faith. Charles Darwin, when he was studying at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, learned taxidermy, which is preserving a dead animal's body by stuffing them for public display. The man who taught him this art was a man who was just getting attention, though it is still very minimal. The Guyanese-born and former slave John Edmonstone. You would think that though Darwin was taught taxidermy by a black man and was also on the panel of the Jamaica Committee for the trial of Governor Eyre, that would affect his views on race. Instead, he wrote a book published in 1859 titled The Origin of Species and the Preservation of the Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. But it was his follow-up where his real views came out in the open in his 1871 Descent of Man, where he recorded that the old Greeks, who stood some grades higher than any race that ever existed, the Western nations of Europe, who now so immeasurably surpass their former savage progenitors and stand at the summit of civilization, the ideological framework for European superiority. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope that the Caucasian, and some are as low as a baboon, instead of as at present, and highlighted in gold, the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. He puts these last two races on an equal par with the gorilla. This man still received a burial in Westminster Abbey. That is why the church cannot condemn racism. This destructive idea that justifies the horrors of colonialism was embraced by Charles Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, who took his ideas to a whole new level and created what today we call genetics, but was originally called eugenics, a pseudoscientific idea that teaches that some races are superior and others are inferior, and men like Egyptologists and archaeologists Sir William Flinders Petrie supported Galton's ideas. These racial superiority ideas were also employed by English biologist Thomas Huxley, Darwin's alter ego, who was also on the Jamaica Committee, and his ideas were supported by a member of the clergy, British Assyriologist and Oxford professor Sir Archibald Henry Sayce. Remember that all westernized racist ideas are either supported by the church or have been created in the church. These ideas of European superiority were to be taken into the scientific fields of anthropology and archaeology. For when the artifacts of Ur of the Chaldees were discovered, Sir Charles Leonard Woolley insisted that the Sumerians, the oldest culture in the Middle East, were white Europeans. The Egyptians made sure that they depicted themselves properly and fairly in their own image in their artwork. And if you just carefully look how they painted their features, they are unique for its already brown complexion. But Hollywood has decided to change their features to make them look like Europeans, claiming, unlike the Greek historians Herodotus and Strabo, that one of the oldest civilizations is actually European. These ridiculous claims can be traced right back to British-Australian Egyptologists Sir Grafton Elliot-Smith, Sir Archibald Sayce and Sir Gardner Henry Wilkinson in the 19th century. The Ife art from the 12th to the 14th century AD in Nigeria is a highly naturalistic sculptural tradition in stone, brass and copper. But when they were rediscovered, the English explorer Mary Henrietta Kingsley insisted that they were made in Birmingham. Leo Frobenius, the German ethnologist, took it a step further and said that they were made by Africans, but it was the Greeks from Atlantis who taught West Africans how to sculpt metal into naturalistic art forms of the human body. But it doesn't stop there.
After 2,000 years, a mystery lost to time is about to be unearthed.
It's the tomb of the Dragon Emperor and his army.
And a legendary evil will be awoken. The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor.
When the Emperor built the Great Wall, he buried his enemies underneath it.
When the massive burial of the terracotta army soldiers was discovered in 1974 in China and Asia, it was a sensation to observe such a find that was traced around 210 BC. But today, Western archaeologists are again making the claims that it was the Greeks who taught the Chinese how to sculpt their own artwork, and many Chinese are falling for it. In the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, is a statue of an ascetic Indian dated around 210 AD, and you can see that modern Indian men reflect their ancestors. But when the German-born Lutheran Oxford professor Friedrich Max Müller saw the similarities between the English and Sanskrit language, he created what is known as the Aryan theory myth that has messed up the people in India. It attempts to prove that light-skinned people from the West brought civilization to the East in India. DNA tests in India have now shown that it is built upon a big colonial lie. In the Huffington Post, it said that it helped to spread another lie that still haunts academia. The Dravidian race theory was formulated by, guess who? British missionaries in the 1800s in parallel with the Aryan theory, and it divides the people into racial categories of Aryans and Dravidians. Western scholars and institutions continue to support Dravidian racism, which is dependent upon acceptance of the Aryan race construct. What about the Bible that was mostly written in the Middle East? In the British Museum, you can see one of the only few descriptions of an Israelite king, and his features are clearly from the Orient, a descendant of Shem. But if you were to look at modern biblical films, once again the racial features have drastically changed so that the children of Israel look like Europeans, a clever way of rewriting history. And the modern Western churches have played a very central role in both colonialism and in racializing human history, and they have sadly played a significant role in damaging the very character and the image of the Almighty God. Historically, all major world empires have colonized those they have conquered. But modern day Western colonialism is responsible for the tensions and the ethnic strikes we see in our world today. And what is more sad is that the churches have been complicit in the racism of their governments, and it is responsible for the identity crises of many people today. If the churches of today were to follow the gospel of Jesus Christ, there would be no racism in the churches. But what is more sad is that even when a people have been enslaved, dehumanized, marginalized, ghettoized, sterilized, and Jim Crowed, no matter what they've been through, they are still pleading to the very system that has psychologically oppressed them. What is more sad is that these systems have rejected their pleas. When man forfeited his Edenic beauty for self-worship, since his fall he has not been able to balance out his threefold nature of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. He has been able to conquer and master the physical plane, as well as the mental and the emotional, but he struggles with that missing ingredient and battles to find it, the spiritual. That can only be filled by reconnecting back to the Creator. But man tries to fill that empty void by harmonizing oneself with nature instead of having faith in the one who actually made the nature. The UK is a place that for many years men throughout Europe have fled to for an asylum to express their views, and have tried to fill that spiritual void with their own warped man-made philosophies, and their ideas have not only spread throughout the European continent, but around the entire world. Scholars are now spending time carefully going over the effects of their philosophies, and as shown in previous studies, they are seeing the damage of their ideas, the toll of human lives they cost, and the emptiness it leaves in the heart. Though their man-made ideas have failed in filling that spiritual vacuum, man still attempts to fill it with ideas from the ancient world that is subtly de-Christianizing and reprogramming the modern mind and training them into having a very nihilistic secular worldview, so that you can put any idea in front of them and they will have absolutely no moral strength to resist it. Many are also foolishly returned to the serpent's philosophy to heal that deep spiritual brokenness, totally ignorant that he was the intellectual mastermind of this world's chaos. But they all end up admitting that when you look for happiness just on the physical plane, ignoring the spiritual, you'll always end up empty. Listen to Moby.
We think that if we have the right amount of money, if we have the right amount of recognition, we'll find perfect human happiness. But I tried, and it didn't work.
So the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, and this should be the most ripe time and opportunity for the professed children of God to fill that spiritual vacuum around the entire world with an eternal message. But there is a big problem and hindrance, for the most influential nation on the planet cannot share something that they themselves do not practice.
Like I tell people, segregation starts every Sunday in America. You can say that this place is integrated and we're all happy and peaceful, but every Sunday at 11 o'clock, that's when the world becomes segregated every day, and it's called the church. Because when everybody goes to church, we go to white churches, the blacks stay in their black churches, and the Mexicans stay in whatever Catholic. That's when the segregation starts.
Have you ever wondered how powerful and influential these churches are, which many see as multinational corporations in North America? From when the Pilgrim Fathers arrived in 1620, they have always had a say or an influence in the American way of life. In a book titled Virtual Murdoch, published in the year 2001, you get a bit of a picture of how they have influenced the vast monopoly of the US cable network. The author said that Pat Robertson, in his own way, is as much a pioneer of the cable industry as Ted Turner or Jerry Lewin and John Malone. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Jimmy Swaggart, Robert Schuller, Jim Baker, Oral Roberts, and Jerry Falwell became household names. By the mid-1980s, Christian preachers had 62 national syndicated shows. The televangelists have greater, unrestricted access to media than any other interest group in America, sociologist Jeffrey Haddon of the University of Virginia told Time. These established churches have a 501(c)(3) tax-free status, where they have accumulated so much wealth by the generous donations of their members that amount not in millions, but in billions. They also have an immense influence on the healthcare system, where at least 1 in 6 hospital beds in the country is in a religiously affiliated hospital, and the Catholic Church, the richest institution in North America, has expanded her tentacles 22% since 2001 in the North American healthcare system. These churches also own around 200 accredited theological seminaries where they enroll nearly 100,000 students a year, and many of the most influential evangelical lay and mega preachers have not only played a central role in swaying US politics and elections, but historically a number of them have had direct access to the seat of US government, the White House. They preach against abortion, LGBTQ, the occult, and violence and swearing in movies. But there is one subject they are very silent on. With this level of influence and control, they could use all of these powerful mediums to completely shut down racism in the United States that would eventually influence the rest of the society in North America. But they choose to remain quiet. Do you want to know why? Because they benefit from it. And modern credible Western sources are confirming, not through malice or bitterness, but through solid journalism, that racism runs very, very deep, today a bit more subtle, into the very heart and metaphysics of the culture, the structure and the man-made theology in these Western churches. The narrator saw a discussion where a white male said that there are a number of white preachers in North America who are being kicked out of their churches and losing their credentials for addressing racism in the church. Sad. Though they are influential, they have been greatly falling in number in recent years. And instead of running to Jesus Christ for their divine strength, they have looked to a reality TV show host for their strength, and people all around the world look on in complete shock. Most of the blacks the narrator has spoken to in both the UK and specifically in the United States said that all of their white friends are in the secular world. They said that they don't trust the ones in the churches. The ones in the world, they said, are more real, easier to get on with, more sincere, and you can discuss the issue of race with them a lot more easily. But when you mention racism to the whites in the churches, how do you think they respond? They also avoid it by usually changing the subject, or they cleverly spiritualize it away by escaping to prayer, not to heal, but to shut you up, or they quickly turn to and misapply prophecy, as Billy Graham is on record saying and documented on CNN. Only when Christ comes again will the little white children of Alabama walk hand in hand with little black children, Graham said after King's speech. So many of these churches, with their warped, unbiblical, colonial white supremacy theology, believe that you can continue having racially segregated congregations and racism will just magically vanish away at the second coming of Christ. Really? Modern scientific studies have shown that when you remain silent on very serious matters, it does a lot more damage and harm than good. So the narrator would like to ask a question to these churches in North America. How do you intend to share the everlasting gospel with a world that can see that you do not represent the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Many African American preachers have spent years trying to reach out to the predominantly white churches in North America for reconciliation, because they are aware that the racial divide is a very, very bad witness for the wider society and to the rest of the world, as American influence around the planet is immense. They have not asked for their daughters' hand in marriage for their sons. They have not asked for any apologies, nor reparations, nor for any special handouts or privileges. But now they are fed up and very frustrated, for they have realized and have come to the conclusion that most of the whites in the churches are just not interested in reconciliation at all. It does not interest them in the least. A few blacks are taking extreme measures and are rioting to vent out their frustrations, misusing the Bible to vent out their rage, which does not really help. But there are a few who are still reaching out, and the narrator has to commend these African Americans, for they have been through quite a lot since post-Reconstruction, to still reach out to a people who do not even want to mix with them and still hold on to their faith. As blacks are not always the best at verbally articulating themselves in the public, they would express their trauma through music, and they would sing about the strange fruit, which was a call to end the 3,466 lynchings of blacks in the United States between 1882 to 1968, where specially appointed photographers would take pictures, and then they would be made into postcards, where churches would announce and sometimes lead out in the lynchings, and parents would take their children and invite family and friends to witness a murder, like it was some form of carnival or entertainment in that so-called professed Christian nation. They would also take their children on looting extravaganzas in predominantly black neighborhoods in race riots that would start in East St. Louis in 1917, continuing in 1919 in Chicago, and ending in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, the infamous Black Wall Street. Some blacks would retaliate, but it is a cleverly covered up era of history. The US government would also seize property in California that blacks owned, and they would take it for themselves. And do you want to know why they did this? National Geographic records that the US was gripped by a reign of racial terror after World War I, when whites rose up to quash, guess what? Prosperous black communities. For over 100 years, they have been marginalized when it comes to housing. It has been called redlining, and the value of your house can give you a certain level of mobility in society. And the narrator will say this for the last time. Westernized racism is deeply rooted in economics. Though we do not excuse the crimes in the black community, there has been a bit of an over-exaggeration in the data. For the 1968 Kerner Commission found that it was poverty and institutional racism that were driving inner-city violence. And the London Guardian also reported that during the civil rights movement there was much more homicide in the black community than there is now. Black-on-black crime is shrinking. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention show that from 1950 to 2013, the percentage of black men who became homicide victims dropped by a third, and for black women the percentage was cut in half. The CDC also published a study in 2013 that shatters the false data of the missing black father, and it documented that black fathers, that is 70%, were most likely to have bathed, dressed, diapered or helped their children use the toilet every day, compared with white 60% and Hispanic fathers 45%. A high percentage of black fathers aged 15 to 44, that is 27%, took their children to or from activities every day, compared with white fathers, that is 20%. You never really hear this data on any mainstream or even alternative media outlet, because it is not what they want to hear. It does not fit into a narrative. Now, the narrator is not saying that it has all been a gloomy downward spiral. That would be sharing disinformation, fabricating history. They have developed their own schools to educate blacks, beginning with Booker T. Washington Tuskegee Institute. During the Harlem Renaissance, many in New York were very prosperous and dressed to the nine. Black jockeys once dominated horse racing in America in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, but their history has been cleverly neglected and airbrushed out of the record books. They also had their own distinct Negro baseball league beginning in the 1920s, when blacks were either kicked out or refused entry into the main league. They also changed the field of archaeology by the discovery of an extinct bison. And there was also a Christian who helped to impact the modern world. The little-known Lewis H. Latimer built a church in New York, and when he was not attending a religious service, this self-taught draftsman was patenting many inventions to improve the society he lived in. He did not invent the light bulb, but he improved the filament to make it last a lot longer. But there is something to his credit. The telephone is probably one of the best methods of modern communication, and the Scottish-born scientist and inventor Alexander Graham Bell is known as the man behind this invention. But when Lewis Latimer died in 1928, the New York Times credited him as drawing the original plans for Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. So when you're using your modern digital tracking devices, always remember that many Christians have invented things that has helped to shape our modern world. But what the narrator does find very troubling is that there are many white Christians who are using social media to post videos on their Facebook pages, as the narrator has seen, of blacks who try to intellectually discredit other blacks. Now, how does that win people to Jesus Christ? And why do these blacks do that? One author said that servants unconsciously imbibe their master's psychology, and so Negroes. The American white Protestants were anti-foreign in America, so the Negro followed suit. And with a false plantation attitude of disinformation and outdated false stats, when you read the comment section of their videos, their huge white following always say, "I wish more black people were like them." There are Christian preachers who also carefully study patriotic blacks and use them to protect their white Euro-American culture under the disguise of Christianity.
As black men, black Americans. I'm not African American, I'm a black American. I was never born in Africa. Yeah, I'm a proud American, right? I just, whatever. You got that? Yeah, I'm not from Africa, I've never been to Africa. Yeah. I don't know nothing about Africa. Okay, I don't speak African, I don't know any African history. I know some American history. Because you're American. Because I'm American.
You better not touch my flag. This is my flag. I hold my flag high. You will not burn it. You will not cut it. You will not tear it. You will not stomp on it. This is my flag. This flag in America means the world to me.
And there are others who form an alliance with the secular world, pretending that they are defending Christianity when they are also protecting their white Euro-American culture. And anyone who mentions racism in the church, they cleverly accuse them of being a woke social justice warrior, a political race theorist who is controlled by the Marxist philosophy of unconscious bias training, and being a member of Black Lives Matter. Now, this is not new. During the civil rights movement, they also saw racial integration as a form of Marxism, and comments on the narrator's tablet from YouTube shows that they have not changed at all. And if you see the posters these men and women have, or their placards, they are layered with scripture texts that are quoted out of context to justify not mixing with blacks. And the Washington Post documented in 2020 that white evangelicals did not see interracial dialogue as a priority. Nothing has changed. But the US culture still reaches out to the church to help in the healing of racism in that society as they realize their influence. So how can we heal and fill that spiritual vacuum? The Holy Scriptures offers us a solution. Before Jesus left this earth, he provided a spiritual package, not just for the church community only, but for them to also help the society they lived in. He is currently our advocate in heaven, interceding on our behalf, but he has instructed us to not have an isolated, gated community gospel where you just preach to yourselves only, but it is to go out to the entire world, not prejudicing any gender, ethnicity, or age. And he taught what should be in the delivery, and he laid the example first. In John chapter 13 and verse 29, he had a bag of money that was to help the poor that were in need in society. Do the mega churches billions do the same? In Mark chapter 8 verses 6 to 8, Jesus catered to people's physical needs in society when they were really hungry. Then in Matthew chapter 4 verses 23 and 24, Jesus also catered to people's spiritual needs, where he was number 1, teaching, number 2, preaching, and number 3, healing and casting out devils. And he also advised us to follow his example to also teach, preach, and to heal. Most men love to teach and to preach so their voice is heard, but the healing that also includes casting out devils is highly neglected and ignored. And in our churches today, there are many people who need healing, and they are spiritually broken because their needs have been neglected, because the church does not want to help those who are suffering from spiritual depression and mental oppression. There are also many people inside of our churches and in society who are under the spell of unclean spirits or are being possessed by devils, and no one available to deliver them. The narrator would like to ask a very serious question.
Do you want to be screened for an attorney?
I don't care.
Mr. Jones.
Is this man suffering from mental oppression, demonic possession, or both? Because if you are limited in a knowledge of spiritual warfare, you'll find it very difficult to fully heal those who are also under spiritual oppression. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16, Jesus said that we are meant to be the light of the world. So when people look at our lives, they are meant to get a glimpse of what God is like. And in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 13, it says that God's people are meant to be the head and not the tail. Let us give two quick examples. In 19th century Britain, when working class children were deprived and neglected, a German immigrant and missionary evangelist preacher, George Muller, set up a school by faith that was funded by the public donations in Bristol, and he gave these orphan children a better life for free, where they could better themselves, read, and have a better start in society. In the 1930s in London, England, there were a lot of abandoned children of mixed race who were neglected in society. So a man would take them out on trips every weekend to also give them a better life. His name was Dr. Harold Moody, a Jamaican immigrant and a Christian doctor, who also founded the League of Coloured Peoples for Blacks in the UK, and he was also the chairman of the London Missionary Society. Like Christ, their model, these two Christian men catered for the outcasts in society, and the world should be looking for the church in resolving complex issues, and the church should provide the solution, especially when it comes to racism. Jesus said in John chapter 13 verses 34 and 35 that how people in the church treat each other will not only affect how the world views the church, but also how they perceive Jesus. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 9, even the unfallen angels of heaven are watching Christians closely to witness a side of God's character that they have never seen. What 1 Peter 1 verse 12 says, which things the angels desire to look into. People watch how you treat each other in the home. They listen to your conversation at work. And when you're typing your hatred and animosity online, people carefully study your comments to see if you represent who you claim that you serve, God or the devil. Our responsibility is a lot bigger than you think, and people's perception of God is how they see Christians live and how they treat each other. The scriptures are very clear that God's ways are above our ways, and while we look on the outward appearance, God looks a little deeper. He looks on the heart. So when we look at these three examples in the Holy Scriptures, Joseph, Moses, and Timothy, we see that God is not interested in race or culture. He focuses on the heart. And Jesus broke down racial barriers as an example when he dialogued with the Roman soldier and the woman of Samaria, which the Bible describes as breaking down the middle wall of partition. So there is no race in God's eyes. If that is the case, how can we heal the racism in the church, which will impact the rest of society? 1 John chapter 4 verses 18, 19, 20, and 21. In that text there is a word that is mentioned 10 times. It says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love." We love him. Why? Because he first loved us. If a man say, "I love God," and hate his brother, he is what? A liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he who loveth God, love his brother also. We all need to closely analyze ourselves and repent. And if this study has agitated and provoked you, it was meant to. But the journey is not over. We still have more ground to cover so the healing can be complete.